morning, Senior Pride here. Today I'm going to discuss an issue that I think is important to all of us. Women will certainly recognize this, but it's important to men too. The reversal of women's rights globally. And we are the generation that fought for equality, that fought for women's rights, that fought for sexual safety in relationships and outside of them. We're the right women who fought for the right to birth control and health care that would save our lives if need be. And yet we are watching the younger generation slide back. So this is important, not only to the younger generation, but to us as well, because we will are paying as rights are removed. So what exactly is happening? Well, we know that we made significant milestones over about 100 years, about a century. And this was true across the world, yet now we're seeing a reversal in women's rights politically, legally, socially, and economically. Depending on where we live, on our cultural norms and our socioeconomic status, it is affecting women in different ways. Okay, so we know that in the 19th and 20th centuries, it was a transformative period for women's rights. In the West, for example, suffrage movements began in the late 19th century. And there were huge victories like the 19th Amendment in the United States in 1920, which gave women the right to vote. Globally, the United Nations established the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, in 1979. And this was a comprehensive treaty aimed at promoting gender equality. However, despite the fact that we have seen increased access to education, healthcare, and employment opportunities, and laws addressing domestic violence, workplace harassment, and reproductive rights, we're now seeing that regress. Remember that for us, the 1960s and 70s were a huge period of change. They were for all women, and we're losing that. So what's happening? What are the major trends? Well, first of all, there's the erosion of reproductive rights. I think the biggest example I can certainly think of in this is the Supreme Court of the United States in 2022, the decision Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health Organization. They overturned Roe versus Wade, and this had repercussions worldwide. Because it ended federal protection of abortion rights, the states are now in kind of this patchwork focus on abortion rights. Some states have banned it outright. Some states have made it so early that many women don't even realize they're pregnant. Women's safety women's health care is impacted because if women's lives are in danger, doctors are afraid to perform abortions at that point because they will go to prison. And because it's impacted us globally, trends like this are occurring worldwide. So in countries such as Poland, abortion laws have become more restrictive. Other nations, including El Salvador and Honduras, maintain absolute bans on abortion. Not surprisingly, these policies mostly affect or disproportionately affect marginalized women who cannot afford to seek health care elsewhere. Another issue that is huge is the political backlash against gender equality. So we have a huge rise of authoritarian and far-right political movements, and these are accompanied by policies and rhetoric that undermine women's rights. Turkey, Hungary, and Brazil have dismissed feminist movements as threats to traditional family values. They've actively worked to reduce funding for women's programs and dismantle gender equality initiatives. In Afghanistan, the Taliban resurged in 2021, and there was an immediate rollback on women's and girls' rights. Girls have been barred from secondary school. Women are restricted from most forms of employment, and of course the enforcement of dress codes has curtailed women's public presence. Economic disempowerment. When COVID-19 came into our environment, it disproportionately impacted women who were more likely to lose jobs, shoulder increased caregiving responsibilities, and face financial instability. The fact is that women account for a significant portion of workers in fields like healthcare, education, and retail. And those were fields that were disproportionately affected by the COVID restrictions. In many countries, women's labor force participation remains significantly lower than men's, and the gender pay gap persists. Economic disempowerment further entrenches inequality by limiting women's access to resources, opportunities, and political influence. There is also an escalation of gender-based violence. It's always remained a pervasive issue globally, and it has become worse in some cases. The lockdowns during COVID-19 saw spikes in domestic violence as women were trapped in abusive households without access to support. Countries such as India, South Africa, and Mexico report high rates of femicide and sexual violence. And this is not surprisingly exacerbated by poor law enforcement and cultural stigma. In conflict zones like Ukraine, Syria, and Yemen, sexual violence has been used as a weapon of war, disproportionately, of course, affecting women and girls. There are also legal and institutional rollbacks. So, for example, in Saudi Arabia, recent reforms have allowed women to drive without a male guardian, but there are systemic inequalities that remain embedded in laws surrounding marriage, divorce, and inheritance. In the United States, challenges to Title IX, which was legislation designed to prevent gender discrimination in education, threaten protections for women and LGBTQ+ individuals. The fact is that even when gender equality laws exist, weak law enforcement, weak regulation often leaves women vulnerable to both discrimination and abuse. So why is this happening? Kind of talked about it before, but I'd like to go into it in a little more detail. First of all, there's the rise of conservatism and these far-right authoritarian regimes. Political leaders in many countries, and this includes America and Canada, use traditional gender roles to consolidate power, appealing to conservative segments of their societies, and attacking progressive policies and instituting regressive policies. Economic pressures. When there are economic instability, which is happening worldwide, it often leads to the scapegoating of marginalized groups, which definitely includes women. Austerity measures are disproportionately designed to cut funding for women's services like shelters and reproductive health care. Cultural and religious factors. Deeply rooted cultural factors and religious beliefs often resist change, and they perpetuate these stereotypes and patriarchal norms. Some leaders exploit these ideals, beliefs, to justify their discriminatory policies, and we see that in the United States. Weak international enforcement. I talked about CEDAW. These treaties exist, but enforcement mechanisms are weak, which allows countries to violate women's rights without significant repercussions. And then, of course, there's online misinformation and harassment. Social media has amplified misogynistic rhetoric. It's enabled the spread of misinformation about feminism, and it's created hostile environments for female activists. So there are numerous consequences, as we can see. Inequality will continue to undermine economic stability, which puts women in position of perpetual poverty, and women who lack education and financial independence can't support themselves and become trapped. As well, the erosion of women's rights fosters environments of intolerance and discrimination, setting back progress not only for women but other marginalized groups. And this is why I talked about men. You think you're not being affected, you're being affected. Men of color, you're being affected. It weakens democracies by marginalizing literally half the population and reducing diversity in leadership and eroding trust in institutions or governments. What can we do to counteract this? Well, the first one is obvious, and I think it's very obvious to learn from my era: grassroots activism and community engagement. We get out there. We talk about changing laws. So, for example, women-led protests in countries like Iran, where the death of Mahsa Amini sparked demonstrations against mandatory hijab laws, highlight the potential of collective activism to change oppressive regimes. And we have to do that worldwide. We have to change this back. We can also look at legal and policy reforms. So policies should definitely focus on ensuring access to reproductive health care. It is about life and death, not just the infant, the woman. So men, if you care about the ladies in your life, your wives, your sisters, your mothers, your partners, your daughters, your granddaughters, your nieces, please think about this. Reproductive health care, including contraception and abortion, are life-saving. We can combat gender-based violence through stricter penalties and stronger survivor support systems. We can promote equal pay and economic opportunities for women. We also need to educate and bring into awareness these issues. So education is critical for breaking the cycle of discrimination. We need to engage in campaigns to raise awareness about gender equality, especially in very conservative or right-wing societies. We need to challenge stereotypes and foster progressive attitudes among younger generations. And I am still stricken by the fact that young men in America voted for a man whose one of his goals is to remove even more in the way of women's rights. They don't know what they've done. We need international cooperation and pressure. We must hold countries accountable for the violation of women's rights. Sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and support for grassroots movements can actually create incentives for governments to enact reforms. We need to harness technology for advocacy instead of discrimination. Yes, online spaces can perpetuate misogyny, but they also offer platforms for advocacy and organizing. They enable women to connect across borders, share resources, and amplify their voices. We can combat harassment through misinformation and increase knowledge, education. The fact is, women's rights are regressing, and it is up to all of us, women, men, everyone. It is up to all of us to fight back and regain the ground we had gained and get even further. And yes, reproductive rights, and I know I'm stressing this, but it needs to be stressed, they are life-changing and life-saving. So, I ask you to think about this issue, to study this issue, to learn about this issue. I will, as I usually do, be providing links in the comment section. And as I always say, if you enjoyed this post, please hit subscribe and share and comment. Please share this with people you may know. Please explore. And remember, to be senior is to be proud. Hugs.